Picture this. I'm standing there with a lukewarm coffee in my hand, watching the fog roll off the water, just trying to enjoy the silence. When I see flashing lights reflecting off the trees, 3 squad cars are rolling up my driveway because someone called 911 on me for parking my own boat on my own lake, on the property I hold the deed to. But what the woman pointing a shaking finger at me from across the property line didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have realized in her wildest nightmares, was that I hadn't just retired from the tech world with a $52 million exit after selling my cloud infrastructure company. No, she didn't know that I had the time, the resources, and the petty level of determination to turn her little power trip into the most expensive lesson of her entire life. Let's rewind a bit. 6 months ago, I was burned out, frying under the fluorescent lights of Silicon Valley, dreaming of open skies. So when the buyout hit my bank account, I ran. I bought a sprawling 50-acre slice of heaven in Montana called Blackwood Ranch, a place with an 8-acre private body of water known as Mirror Lake that sat there like a sapphire dropped in the dirt. The previous owner, a crusty old guy named Old Man Miller, handed me the keys with a cryptic warning, telling me to watch out for the vultures in the subdivision next door, a place called Pine Creek Preserve. But I didn't listen. I was too busy imagining the bass fishing. The trouble started the very first morning I took my 24-foot boat out. I was barely drifting, listening to the birds, when I saw her, Karen Sterling, the HOA president of Pine Creek Preserve, marching down to the shoreline like she was invading Poland, clipboard in hand, hair sprayed into a helmet of authority that could withstand a hurricane. She screamed across the water that my boat was an aesthetic violation and a visual blight on their community standards. And when I politely motored over to explain that I wasn't part of her HOA and that this was my private land, she turned a shade of purple I didn't know existed in nature. She told me the HOA covenants were clear, that my industrial vessel was lowering their property values, and that if I didn't remove it, she'd sue me into oblivion. And as she stormed back to her white Range Rover, I realized this wasn't just a neighborly dispute, it was a declaration of war. Being a guy who solves problems for a living, I didn't get mad. I got studious, spending the next 3 nights buried in county archives, smelling like dust and old paper, trying to figure out how this woman thought she had jurisdiction over my ranch. That's when I met Officer Dan Higgins, a county inspector who looked like he'd aged 10 years in the last 10 minutes. And he told me, "Look, son, Karen has filed 60 complaints this year alone. She's a menace, but she knows the code better than we do." But then, Higgins dropped a hint that changed everything. He mentioned that Karen's harassment strategy was always the same: file complaints until the victim goes broke or moves. But while digging through those dusty records in the basement of the courthouse, I found the smoking gun, a document from the 1970s that revealed the developer of Pine Creek Preserve had lied to every single homeowner, promising them exclusive lake access that he never actually owned. The water rights to Mirror Lake didn't belong to the subdivision. They never had. They belonged entirely to Blackwood Ranch, meaning for the last decade, Karen and her cronies had been trespassing every time they launched a kayak. Every time they dipped a toe in the water, they were invading my property. I sat in my truck that night, watching the moon reflect off the water, realizing that Karen wasn't just annoying, she was legally exposed. But before I could spring the trap, she escalated. She formed a lake restoration committee and started spreading rumors that I was running a commercial shipping operation. She even got her husband, a creepy guy named Richard, to stand at the property line with a telephoto lens, photographing me every time I drank a beer on my porch. They posted these photos on the neighborhood app, claiming I was an environmental terrorist destroying the ecosystem, and the comments section turned into a digital lynch mob, calling for my head, calling for me to be run out of town. I knew I needed heavy artillery, so I hired Elena Ross, a property attorney with a reputation for eating HOAs for breakfast, and she cost a fortune. But she was worth every penny because within 48 hours she found out that Karen had been charging her residents a $2,000 annual fee for lake maintenance and access, collecting over $100,000 for amenities she didn't own, which Elena pointed out with a shark-like grin, is technically wire fraud. While Elena built the legal case, I installed 4K security cameras along the shoreline, turning my ranch into a surveillance state. And sure enough, the footage started rolling in. Residents launching boats from my land, Karen giving tours of her lake to prospective buyers, and Richard dumping bags of unauthorized fertilizer right into the water. The psychological pressure was intense. I couldn't go to the grocery store without people glaring at me because Karen had convinced the town I was some evil billionaire ruining their paradise. And then came the false police reports, claiming I was speeding, claiming I was drunk operating a vessel, claiming I was threatening children. It culminated when the sheriff showed up because Karen reported a maniac with a weapon on the water, which turned out to be me holding a fishing rod, and even the deputies were getting sick of it. But they had to investigate every call. I was ready to just sue them and be done with it. But then I found out the real reason behind the harassment. It wasn't about the view. It was a land grab, because Richard worked for a massive development firm called Apex Horizons, and they wanted to force me to sell Blackwood Ranch cheap so they could bulldoze it and expand their subdivision. That realization hardened my heart. This wasn't just petty, it was predatory, so I decided to look downstream, literally, to see who else was being affected by this water war. And that's when I drove 2 miles down the creek to a place called Riverbend Marina. The marina was a ghost town, a relic of a better time, run by a man named Sam Carter, a 70-year-old Vietnam vet who looked like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Sam told me he was losing the place, that his wife's medical bills had wiped them out and the bank was foreclosing in 2 weeks. But then he said something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He said, "The funny thing is, that HOA up there, they use my boat launch all the time. Never pay a dime. They act like they own the river." Sam pulled out an old map, his hands shaking slightly, and showed me the hydrology of the area, explaining that Mirror Lake feeds the entire creek system, meaning whoever controls my dam controls the water level for his marina, and legally, my property held senior water rights, dating back to 1890. Elena, my lawyer, nearly dropped her phone when I told her. She said, "Alex, do you realize what this means? If you own the senior rights, you don't just control your lake. You legally control every drop of water that flows through that subdivision and into the marina. You have a monopoly." The gears in my head clicked into place with a terrifying precision. Karen and Apex Horizons wanted to drive me out, but they had accidentally handed me the keys to the kingdom. I looked at Sam, a man about to lose his family legacy, and I looked at the map, and I saw a way to save him and destroy Karen in one single check-writing motion. I was going to buy the marina. I sat across from Sam Carter in his dusty office, the smell of stale coffee and two-stroke engine oil in the air, and I made him an offer that made him weep openly. I would buy Riverbend Marina for $1.2 million cash, paying off all his debts, saving it from the bank, but with one condition. He stays on as manager, full salary, benefits, and the family legacy stays his. He shook my hand, tears streaming into his gray beard, not knowing that he had just become the most important piece in a chess game played with real estate and federal laws. We moved fast, closing the deal in 7 days under a shell company I named Ironflow Holdings, so Karen Sterling and her spies wouldn't see my name on the deed until it was too late. Meanwhile, I turned my dining room into a war room, maps plastered on the walls, timelines of Karen's harassment, and Elena brought in a water rights specialist named Arthur Pendleton, a man who spoke in statutes and smiled like a crocodile. Arthur confirmed that by owning the marina and the ranch, I now controlled the water access for the entire valley, effectively landlocking Pine Creek Preserve without them even knowing it. Karen, unaware that the ground was crumbling beneath her feet, decided to go nuclear. She filed a petition with the city to have my property rezoned as a conservation easement, which would ban all boats, effectively trying to seize my land through bureaucracy. She posted on social media that I was poisoning the water table, a lie so bold it was almost impressive, and she rallied a mob to protest outside my gates, people holding signs calling me a water thief, screaming at me as I drove in and out. But then things got dark, really dark. My cameras caught Richard sneaking onto my dock at 3 a.m., a shadow moving in the moonlight, and I watched in real time as he took a hunting knife and slashed the mooring lines of my boat, setting it adrift. I didn't call the cops immediately. I let the camera roll, capturing his face clearly in the infrared light, capturing the malice in his eyes, because I knew a vandalism charge was good, but I needed something that would bury them. 2 days later, my water quality sensors triggered an alarm, and I rushed down to the creek feeding the marina to find an oily sheen on the water, smelling of death and chemicals. Karen's restoration committee had been dumping used motor oil and pool chemicals into the stream, trying to frame me for environmental damage to get the EPA involved, a tactic so reckless it endangered the entire watershed. Sam called me from the marina, panicking, saying dead fish were washing up, and that's when the gloves came off. This wasn't a game anymore. This was a felony. We gathered the evidence. The video of Richard with the knife, the water samples proving the chemical dumping came from the HOA drainage pipes, the financial records of Karen's fraud, and we waited for the monthly town hall meeting. Karen had planned this meeting as her victory lap. She had invited the press, the city council, and the entire neighborhood to witness her taking down the billionaire. She wanted a show, so I decided to give her one. The night of the meeting, the community center was packed, the air thick with tension and the smell of cheap perfume and sweat. Karen stood on stage with her microphone, looking like a televangelist, preaching about the evils of outsiders and corporate greed. She pointed at me, sitting quietly in the back with Elena and Sam, and screamed, "That man is destroying our way of life. He hates this community." And for a moment, the crowd believed her, their anger directed at me like a physical force. But then, Karen made a fatal mistake. She called Sam out, accusing the marina of being a haven for drugs and filth, attacking the one man in town everyone actually respected. The room went quiet, uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, and that was my cue. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and walked to the front not with anger, but with the calm of an executioner, plugging my laptop into the projector system as Karen tried to shout over me, demanding I be removed. "I'm not here to argue," I said, my voice amplified through the speakers. "I'm here to show you a movie," and I hit play. The first image was the deed to Riverbend Marina, showing Iron Flow Holdings as the owner, and then the next slide revealed me as the owner of Iron Flow. The gasps in the room were audible as they realized the outsider now owned the town's most beloved business. Then came the video montage, played in high definition on the massive screen behind me. Richard slicing my boat lines, looking like a criminal in the night. Karen caught on a hot mic admitting, "We just need to make his life hell until he sells to Apex." And finally, the drone footage of HOA members dumping oil into the creek. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy, suffocating, as the neighbors looked at Karen, then at Richard, then back at the screen, realizing they had been lied to, manipulated, and made accomplices to a crime. Karen tried to rush the stage, screaming that it was deep-faked, that I was a hacker, her face contorted into a mask of pure panic. But the sheriff, Sheriff Miller, who had been standing in the back, stepped forward, his hand resting on his belt. I looked Karen dead in the eye and dropped the final bomb. "Furthermore, Mrs. Sterling, since your HOA has no legal access to the water, and since you have been charging residents for access you don't own, my attorney has just filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of every homeowner here for fraud, and we're seeking damages for every cent you've collected in the last 10 years. The room erupted, not at me, but at her. People were standing up, shouting, demanding their money back. Chaos took over as the veneer of her authority shattered into a million pieces. Richard tried to sneak out the side door, but Sheriff Miller was already there, handcuffs glinting under the fluorescent lights, because vandalism over a certain dollar amount is a felony in Montana, and dumping oil? That's federal. Watching the collapse of Karen Sterling's empire was like watching a controlled demolition, precise, violent, and oddly beautiful. The sheriff arrested Richard right there in the hallway of the community center, the click of the handcuffs echoing louder than any shout, while Karen was escorted out, still screaming about conspiracies, a queen without a kingdom, dragged away from the very people she claimed to lead. The video of the meeting hit the internet by morning. Local news vans camped out on her lawn, not to interview her, but to film the HOA from hell. And suddenly, the eyesore wasn't my boat, it was her. The legal fallout was catastrophic for them. Karen was slapped with multiple lawsuits, fraud, defamation, and harassment. Her legal bills drained their savings in months, and the civil suit from the neighbors she had scammed for those lake fees forced them to put their house on the market. But nobody in Pine Creek Preserve wanted to buy it. It sat there like a cursed object, eventually selling for a fraction of its value as they fled the state, moving somewhere into the Midwest where nobody knew their names. Richard took a plea deal, dodging prison time by agreeing to 500 hours of community service, most of which was spent cleaning up the trash along the very river he tried to pollute, wearing a bright orange vest, a poetic justice that I watched from my deck with a satisfied smile. But the real victory wasn't the revenge, it was the restoration. Riverbend Marina came back to life, fueled by the capital I injected and the community's goodwill. We held a grand reopening, a freedom from tyranny barbecue, where Sam Carter cut the ribbon, looking 10 years younger, his family surrounding him, secure in the knowledge that their legacy was safe. I handed the mayor a check for $50,000 to start an environmental cleanup fund, covering every cent of damage the HOA caused, and then some, proving once and for all who the real environmental terrorist was. The vibe in the valley changed. Neighbors started waving at me again, realizing I wasn't the villain, just a guy who wanted to fish. Elena Ross, the attorney who helped me dismantle the regime, she and I started spending a lot more time together, not discussing case law, but sitting on the dock, watching the sunset, finding out that shared trauma and a love for justice is a pretty solid foundation for a relationship. We turned the ranch into a model for water conservation, working with the university to study the ecosystem, ensuring that Mirror Lake would remain pristine for generations, not just for me, but for everything downstream. Apex Horizons, the shady developer behind Richard, pulled out of the county completely, spooked by the bad press and the realization that I wasn't going to sell, no matter how much pressure they applied. The new HOA board at Pine Creek was elected a month later, a group of reasonable people who immediately reached out to me to negotiate a legal access agreement, which I granted for a fair price, with all proceeds going to Sam's Marina improvements. 6 months later, I'm back on that dock, coffee in hand, watching a kid teach his dad how to cast off the new public pier we built at the marina. Sam's grandson runs up to me showing off a base the size of a football, grinning ear to ear, and I realized that the $52 million in the bank didn't make me happy. This did. Standing up to a bully, protecting a good man, and turning a war zone back into a home, that was the real payoff. It makes you think, doesn't it? We live in a world where people with a little bit of power think they can crush anyone who doesn't fit their aesthetic, who doesn't bow to their rules. Karen thought she was the hero of her own story, defending her property values. But she forgot that property values don't mean a thing if you lose your soul in the process. Justice isn't just about punishment, it's about balance. It's about making sure that the Sams of the world don't get crushed by the Karens. So here is the question I want to leave you with, and I want you to really think about this in the comments. Was I too harsh? Did destroying her life, her finances, and humiliating her publicly go too far? Or is that exactly what happens when you try to weaponize the law against an innocent person? Where is the line between justice and vengeance, and did I cross it? Let me know what you would have done if you were in my shoes. And if you enjoyed watching a petty tyrant get absolutely dismantled, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because believe it or not, living out here in the Wild West, this isn't the only story I've got. Stay safe, stand your ground, and I'll see you in the next one.